welcome back, and I hope and trust you've already started to chat to other people who are here at Congress, change opinions, exchange opinions, have good conversations, plenty more networking time coming up. Incidentally, I wonder whether anyone has noticed their name badge. I was just having this conversation with Dan. Dan, raise your hand. Dan, okay, fantastic. I said, have you noticed your name badge? And he said, yeah, it's got my name on it. I said, yes, but what's it made out of? And he was like, oh. Now, Dan's from Wisconsin, and he correctly said it's actually cotton. So your name badge, don't lose it. And can I say, please don't get it wet? He just said, oh, it can go through the washing machine. No, it can't. Make sure you take your name badge home with you, because your name badge can be planted. Your name badge is full of seeds. Yes. How lovely is that? So a little present to take away with you, and you'll have to let us know what grows from them. So let's continue with the real burning questions of the day. We're going to talk about cobalt now in the global drive for raw materials. Now, this was an area that was talked about in the report. Harry touched on it, but we're going to go into a lot more detail now. It's really all to do with the political relationships, the global political relationships. As countries look to source cobalt, we see the change in how other countries align themselves, the clubs, the business relationships, the trading relationships that start to emerge. So what is this going to do for the industry moving forward? Well, to chair and to moderate your next panel, please welcome on stage the Head of Government and Public Affairs at the Cobalt Institute, Mike Blakeney.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be joined by a really interesting panel today. And as you mentioned, this is a panel about the global drive for raw materials. I hope you got the pun. I hope you appreciated it. No. Okay, no one got the pun, but it's okay, because there'll be more where that came from. I'm a dad. I do dad jokes. That's my thing. Today, we wanted to talk about the interface between policy, legislation, and regulation. Please don't leave. It will be interesting, I promise. We're going to do our best. And really, why did we want to talk about this? When I joined the Cobalt Institute a few years ago, there was some conversation about the politics of cobalt, but in the years since, it's really risen up the agenda. And now when we talk about all the things that we do as an industry, we see geopolitics being something that's talked about, sourcing of cobalt, the recycling of cobalt, responsible sourcing of cobalt, the environmental due diligence around cobalt, the conversation about free market versus protectionism, about chemicals management, about incentives for investment, but also bans as well. And so really, in this context, we're moving from an industry that's been relatively small and relatively niche to one that's growing, but with it also coming increased pressures and increased regulation. And so what does that mean for the industry? What does that look like? And what will we have to do? And we've got 90 minutes. In fact, less. We've got 80 minutes now. So no pressure, but there's a lot to get through. For better or for worse, cobalt has long since stopped being something that's peripheral. It's now in the heart of legislation. It's talked about in policy and political circles. It has very, very heated political discussions taking place around it. And really, the panel today is we wanted to explore some of these. So what will the world of cobalt look like in 2030? What will policy do to impact it? What will regulation do to impact it? Will that be good? Will that be bad? And what does it mean for the global economy? I'm really delighted today to be joined by an excellent panel. I'll invite them up in a second to join. But just to give a quick overview, Peter Handley, who is head of unit DG Grow at the European Commission. I was slightly joking, but it's also true. Earlier this year, when we were trying to have conversations about the Critical Raw Materials Act in the EU, no matter who I went to, in whatever part of the Commission, they all replied with one simple line, which is, go and speak to Peter. So we did, and he's here today. So thank you, Peter, for joining us, someone who's at the very heart of some of these conversations at a European level. I'm also really delighted to be joined by KaLeigh, who is the CEO of Westwin Elements. KaLeigh has a really interesting background because she started life in politics, and then she went into cobalt refining, that well-trodden path that I'm sure you're all very familiar with. But I think that also speaks to the nature of the industry and how it's changed. I'm also joined by Zhou Kaderavek, hoping I pronounced your surname correctly. I always struggle with that, who is the CEO of Cobalt Blue, who is setting up a mine at Broken Hill in Australia. So that will be bringing online Australia, obviously the world's second largest reserves of cobalt, and bringing online capacity there. I think that's a really interesting conversation in the broader context. And also Rachel Zhou, who is online, and she is Deputy General Secretary of the Responsible Cobalt Initiative. I'll maybe just take this opportunity just to invite the panelists up to join me, and we'll have a conversation. So, okay, well actually, do you know what? I'm going to start with a question to the audience. So, I talked a little bit just now about the changes in the industry by 2030. I'm going to ask a question. Do you think that we source about 70% of cobalt from China at the moment in terms of refined product, about 65% roughly from the DRC. Show of hands, who thinks that by 2030 that share will look different? Don't be shy. Okay, I expect there's probably some shyness in the audience, but I think that was a good number of hands. Maybe show of hands if you don't think it will change. Okay, so there's a few hands there. So it's mixed. I think there was more for the first one, but less for the second one. Now to the panel. What do you think? So yes or no, do you think it'll look different? KaLeigh?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. And yes.
And Rachel?
The same, yes.
Yes, OK. All right, so that's interesting. So maybe, KaLeigh, I can start with you. Could you explain to me, why do you think that?
Well, time comes with change inevitably often. And so there's so many geopolitical factors that are changing the cobalt landscape, most notably in the realm that we have view of, is that China, being a foreign entity of concern to the United States, can no longer be a reliable supplier of materials that contain cobalt, alloys, permanent magnets, batteries. And so that alone, and this rising demand for domestic, in the United States, domestic production of cobalt, and the ESG considerations that have to be met for American supply, will create an incredible change of the cobalt landscape in the next 10 years.
Peter, obviously the Critical Raw Materials Act has a few things to say about trying to encourage investment. Maybe we'll come to the Critical Raw Materials Act later on, but maybe you can give us a bit of background on why you think it'll change. Will it be in the EU?
I'm sure that the global supply chain for cobalt and for all other critical raw materials will change quite a lot in the next several years, but beyond that also. And the reason is that the world is trying to make a transition away from fossil fuels, and that transition leads you into technologies which are all much more metals and minerals intensive than today's technologies. So the whole world which is signed up to the Paris Agreement is going to be looking for these materials and going to be trying to develop the reliable supply chains and the reliable value chain approaches that give them the security that they need. So that's just for the green agenda. But on top of that, there's a whole shift towards a digital economy around the world, and that's also metals and minerals intensive. Think of semiconductors, for example. And as we heard in the last session, there's also growing security and defense needs which are impacting also on the security of supply for these critical raw materials. So together, the green, the digital, and the defense agenda, I think, is going to drive an awareness that governments and regional organizations will need to become more active in helping to provide the signals that the markets need to secure supply of these materials.
And maybe, Rachel, I can come to you. There was a couple of points in there about China, and you mentioned you think the market will change. How do you think it will change?
Thanks, Mike. So I think it is good news to share the insights from our side. So we are pleased to see more and more the their capacity on their processing and mining across the global society. So also, as you may know, that the China, especially in their processing their mineral, especially the cobalt and other critical minerals, also is.
Okay, I tell you what. Whilst we get Rachel back, I'll maybe go to Zhou. Zhou, do you have any comments?
Look, I think inevitably there's a change in cobalt demand more towards the chemical space. And that demand is largely more consumer focused, be it in electric vehicles, be it in personal products, and even storage devices have a large personal element to that. So I think the change in demand, the coincident focus, regulatory focus on decarbonisation is going to create a whole new stimulus, and we've seen that in the last 6 to 12 months from both the EU and the US. So I think there's an inevitable change ahead in terms of both the extraction, processing, and all the way downstream. And the significant announcements we've seen in the battery industry in North America investment is testimony to that.
Thank you. So, Rachel, are you back? Sorry, Rachel. You were making a really good point, and then I think you cut off.
I'm so sorry for that.
No problem.
Okay, I just mentioned that our standard used for the other stages of the cobalt supply chain has been approved by the international organizations. And we have also carried out a study on the maturity on the due diligence management of the cobalt companies last year. So we have seen that is very inspiring. So we have seen a lot of the progress of the cobalt supply chain companies, which is mostly the RCM members, so who are operating the cobalt. So their awareness and the capacity of their due diligence and their ESG issue management has been greatly improved. So also they have set up their full-time staff to operate the ESG management and the supply chain management. So no matter the cobalt and the other metals across the global society, I think the companies, not just including the Chinese companies, I mean the global mineral supply chains companies have come into the consensus to strengthen the ESG issues and supply chain management. So it is very good news to hear that. So I could share more information in the following discussion.
Thank you, Rachel. So that's a really interesting point, and we'll come back to some of the responsible sourcing issues in a moment. But I wanted to maybe just come back to you, KaLeigh, for a second and just say, because you've got an interesting story. You came from politics and then went into cobalt refining. And I'd like to know, why did you make that change, and what does that say about the cobalt industry?
Well, I'm a patriot and I'm an entrepreneur. And so while I had an advertising company that had a diverse political clientele, both domestic and internationally, and I was regularly involved in political activities in the United States, one way that you can have political influence is I had 2 super political action committees, and I managed a lot of PAC money, so I was very involved congressionally. But I also, as an entrepreneur, I started my first business when I was a teenager, and so I've always had a knack for turning a profit. But in grad school, I studied national security, and I focused actually on critical metals and their relevance to U.S. security interests in Democratic Republic of the Congo. I had clients in Congo. So there are a number of parts to that story that led me to the decision, but ultimately, it came from realizing the great significance of these critical metals for our defense capabilities. And I continually, along with others, grew concern about Chinese independence that the United States had for these materials. And if you look over the past decade, the restrictions that China has placed on the U.S. in terms of access, they've actually multiplied by 5 times in a variety of different forms, whether it was taxes. Even last year, China sanctioned Raytheon and Northrop Grumman. The year prior, there was severe pressure on the Pentagon and Congress not allowing Lockheed Martin to access alloys out of China. So Lockheed Martin had to cease production of F-35 fighter jets. So I come from a very patriotic family, and I think that protecting my country, a country that I love very much, was something worth pursuing. And certainly this industry is one of great profit potential, as you see the demand for these materials in the electrification process, the clean energy transition, truly compounding the demand for these materials. So those were some of the elements that led me to the decision to move forward and build America's only nickel and cobalt refinery.
Because I was going to say, because there's actually, as I understand it, there is zero cobalt refining capacity in the US at the moment.
Refining capacity for cobalt in the United States and little to none for nickel. We're starting with these metals. However, there's also a severe deficit of other critical metal refining capacity, lithium, graphite, the list goes on. And, you know, independence and critical mineral independence is something of great significance to our country, and I'm sure many of the countries represented in this room.
Thank you. Peter, maybe I can come to you as well, because I guess that's kind of leading us kind of naturally into a conversation about, you know, the sort of the politics and how the politics is shaping the cobalt market. The EU obviously felt it needed to do something, and that's why it's published the Act this year, which obviously is not completely new. I mean, the critical minerals, the critical raw materials list has existed for some time, but there was obviously some incentive to go further. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about what the Critical Raw Materials Act is for people who don't know, and you know, what it's aiming to achieve.
Yeah, so I'm just going to piggyback on something that KaLeigh was talking about. I would like to be clear, the European Critical Raw Materials Act is not about decoupling from China. Okay, for us, the key reasons for acting are two. The first is that we've looked into our strategic dependencies for what Europe wants to achieve, and we've found that we're dangerously overexposed because we're overly dependent on single sources of supply for the things which are crucial for our ability to do what we want to do. As I say, in the green, the digital, and the defense space. So we're trying to reduce our strategic dependencies, and we're trying to rebalance. We're trying to do more with the potential that we have domestically in Europe. And going back to the earlier session, we do have capacity. We just haven't bothered to exploit it. We've preferred to outsource the production of many of these critical minerals for the last 2 to 3 decades. And we need to do something to reverse that. But that will only take us so far. It will give us a certain amount of domestic capacity. But we will also need to really address the over-concentrated supply from outside. So we're trying to diversify the external supply and offer our partners a better deal, in the sense that we want to help them develop local value from the raw materials that lie underneath their soil. So that's part of our diversification strategy.
Thank you. And Zhou, I guess you're part of that diversification. Australia, I think, forgive me, I hope this is a fair assessment. It's got the world's second largest reserves, but it's not the world's second largest supplier. And in a conversation where you've got KaLeigh saying, well, we want to get cobalt from diverse sources, you've got Peter saying we want to get cobalt from diverse sources. What's Australia's role?
Yeah, just to touch on that point, so Australia has about 20% of the world's cobalt resource, and we're producing just on 3% today. Excuse me. We're number 3 in the world, but that number will lag going forward unless we do something about that. So, you know, we're looking to bring new cobalt processes in, production in. One of the limitations with all these projects, be they cobalt, lithium or others, is they're typically innovative processing technologies involved. So one of the reticence in bringing these projects in is that you're using non-standard technologies. And that tends to hamper development. That tends to mean that we have to showcase our technology for longer periods until we get acceptance from funders. And one of my concerns with the legislation coming from both the EU and the US is that it's not cognizant of the time frames required to bring new mines in. It's a very positive thing to incentivise EVs, to incentivise consumption of those EVs. It's a very positive thing to look at the battery components and make sure that the OEMs have the right battery packs ready to go out, but it's another thing entirely to bring that incentivisation all the way up to the mining area, and I'm talking from an Australian context as well, and allow that stimulus to actually create meaningful change and bring new mines in. So my key point there is it takes a long time to bring a mine in. It takes an even longer time in an environment where you have new technologies, and then you've got a violent metal price to aim for at the same token. So all of these are hamstringing the industry, but I feel confident that with good coordinated sovereign policy between the Australians, the US, the EU and others, we can overcome the hurdles. And I think the IRA and the CRMA Acts are both very positive steps forward.
Thanks, Zhou. And Rachel, maybe I can come to you in a second, because I think there's been a few comments there about diversification, about single sourcing. Obviously, China's been incredibly successful in the cobalt refining space and has lots of big miners also involved in the space as well. You also mentioned at the beginning you see diversification as something that will happen. Maybe you can touch on what you think that would look like, but also in a world of free trade, I presume China's always going to have an influential role.
Thank you, Mike, for your question. So before I answer this question, I hope to briefly introduce or update the RCI. So the predecessor of the RCI is the Responsible Cobalt Initiative. But since the last year, we have upgraded the Responsible Cobalt Initiative to the Responsible Critical Mineral Initiative. So it is due to the trends of the more and more attention on the critical minerals within the renewable battery industry. So far we have incorporated more multiple mineral companies across the mining processor and the downstream companies to be our members. So that is why we think the diversity is very important, not only to produce the critical minerals and the products which are needed for the renewable battery industry. Also, we hope to collaborate other different stakeholders across all of the global society to work together on mitigating the risks in the producing countries, maybe or other covered regions. So I think we shared the benefits and we share the responsibility to call for the joint actions on the high quality supply chain management. So last November, we have launched joint actions on the high level quality supply chain management. So we have updated our name to the and with the new mission. So we think that the joint actions working on the responsible sourcing and the formalized governance of the mine sites are very important. Also, we have developed the serious standards like the Cobalt ASM ESG management framework, using for supporting the local stakeholders to jointly formalize the governance of the Cobalt ASM mine sites. Also, we developed the Cobalt refiner due diligence standard, which is the unique standard used for the cobalt, which is our outpost for the industry. So so far, the new RCI has more than 30 members so far across from the mining sites to the downstream companies. So welcome for the attention to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm coming back to you, Zhou, because you made a point earlier, and I think it's worth exploring. I know we've had conversations about this in the past. There's been a lot of focus in recent years on where the primary supply is going to come from. We can maybe talk about recycling later. But I'm particularly interested to know, I know we've talked about tailings in the past and the opportunities around tailings. I don't know, would you like to talk about that a bit more? Sure.
So we have quite a detailed view on mining waste, effectively, and recycling of mining waste. So if I can speak on behalf of our company for a moment, Cobalt Blue has an intellectual property that allows us to extract metals from pyrite and refractory sulfides, which tend to be incumbent in a lot of tails and mining waste globally. So 100 years ago, they put to the waste dump valuable metals because they couldn't deal with the mineral that those metals were locked in. So this is where we come in. So it's a win from the environment point of view in the sense of we take out the sulphur and the acid-forming materials, but we also can commercialise the metals, which critically in an Australian context contains a lot of cobalt. So that's a really exciting part of the go forward. And I think once that metal then goes into the economy as a whole, and I know the EU has a focus that it should be retained within its borders and then further recycled. So mining waste will become batteries, will become black waste, become recycled. So it's a strong business model. And I think countries all over the world, North America, South America, have vast deposits of metals sitting there at surface dumps which we can recycle.
Because Peter, I know that's in the Critical Materials Act.
Yeah, precisely. We have been mining for centuries and putting on land heaps and heaps of materials which were valueless at the time, but now with the increasing demand for metals and minerals, it's a low-hanging fruit for material that's already in a more concentrated form than the subsoil reserves. And it's in regions which are used to mining. We have coal waste, we have bauxite waste, we have iron ore waste, we have all sorts of waste. And we're trying to inventorize this in Europe. And one of the things we want to do is create an obligation to quantify the critical raw materials potential of the mining waste and tailings that we have throughout the European Union. And we're not alone. Well, we actually have some projects really happening right now. Up in the north of Sweden, for example, LKAB is recovering phosphates and rare earths from its iron ore waste. And in the Czech Republic, we have the recovery of battery-grade manganese from mining waste, which these are just two examples that it can be done. And we know that we're not alone. We know that the United States, as part of its supply chain initiative, is looking into this very much as well.
Great. KaLeigh, do you have views on that?
Yes, I think the forecast that we've seen from OEMs and then also the demand that the U.S. government's going to play as a consumer, I mean, I don't think that will fully be sufficient, but should certainly be used. I will say, on top of the growing OEM demand that we're seeing, our Department of Defense, whether it's feasible, it is certainly their announced goal that by 2035, they want the entire non-tactical fleet to move towards electrification. And they're in trials right now on the tactical fleet to also move through electrification. And they have immense stockpiling demands for the National Defense Stockpile. So not only do you see this growing forecast from the OEMs, but even on the defense side, it's growing. So yes, it's obviously super valuable and should be used. There's a company in the United States called Missouri, well, it was Missouri Cobalt. Now it's U.S. Strategic Metals, and yeah, they are producing cobalt hydroxide from old tailings from an old lead mine, and I'm hoping more of those will come online.
So do you think diversification of sourcing is something that's talked about a lot? And we've talked a bit about getting it from tailings, Australia, the role that different countries has. In your view, as someone who is a buyer of cobalt, is diversification possible?
I sure hope so. So, yes, I think it's possible. And though I think there should be, I have a big part of my heart in the Congo, and I think the resources there are, we know that there's still plenty of more to be had, and Westwin has offtake from a company producing cobalt hydroxide in Congo. We can even diversify within Africa. There are several other African countries that could be incredibly strategic partners, especially for the United States. So yes, I think it's possible, and I am very grateful for the moves that my country has made towards developing those international partners and resource partners. So 2019, there was an intergovernmental agency developed called Prosper Africa, combining a variety of international funding opportunities, whether it's DFC or XM, USAID, a number of hosts, billions of dollars that have been allocated towards foreign direct investment in these resource-rich countries. And then you also see the U.S. Mineral Strategic Partnership Alliance. Our U.S. State Department has really been actively involved in trying to, again, inspire that diversification and certainly bring U.S. support behind it. So the U.S. is heavily investing in a number of agencies. Hundreds of billions of dollars have been allocated for the domestic production. But we know that even if all of our reserves were developed, which we're decades away from that, that still will not be enough. So I think it's possible. There's a lot of work to be done, but I'm very excited about the progress moving towards that achievement.
Thank you. And Peter, maybe I can come to you because diversification is obviously something I'm sure you've been looking at. We mentioned the DRC and partnerships with countries. I'm not sure how much you're allowed to say, but I guess I know those. I know there are conversations happening within the Commission about how that goes looking forward. So I don't know if you have any comments on that.
Yes. Well, I've been negotiating these strategic partnerships for raw materials since 2020. That's when we started. And so far, we've put in place partnerships with Canada, which has led to some really big investments taking place, particularly in relation to the battery raw materials and the battery value chain, but also the automotive sector themselves, the OEMs. With Ukraine, we see this, given Ukraine's potential for raw materials, we see this as one of the ways we can help with the reconstruction of the Ukrainian economy. And we've got more recent partnerships with Namibia, our first one in Africa, which covers critical raw materials and green hydrogen. And the other one we concluded last year was with Kazakhstan. And we're busy with a number of other countries. In fact, we've just initiated preparatory talks with the Democratic Republic of Congo because we would like very much to partner with that country and others in Africa. Very much tapping into what we heard from the previous session about the legitimate interest in getting more economic benefit and social welfare from sitting on this wealth of raw materials. So that's our value proposition. We would like to engage with these countries to help bring investment in. We're unlikely to bring big mining companies because we don't have a lot, but we can bring the off-takers or the investors in mining projects. We do have a lot of strength in the metallurgical and the refining and processing, and we can help try and bring this capacity into these countries. But we can also do lots of the flanking actions where we can help with developing infrastructure and clean energy to make these whole mining and processing operations cleaner. And we can help maybe also in helping these countries to recover the raw materials that are in their own economies, particularly if they're receiving from the Western world lots of these small electronic devices. I think there's a circular economy story which is just as valid for developing countries as it is for the West.
I mean, that's something we haven't touched on yet, but recycling. I mean, is recycling going to be a big part of this?
I hope so, but I don't see that happening for the next 7 to 8 years just because the end-of-life batteries, at least, and I'm mostly just speaking from the demands of our refinery project. I don't see there being the end-of-life batteries to shred enough to produce the black mass and the volumes that we need to fully fund the requirement of our facility. But as those batteries do expire in the next 7 to 8 years, I think black mass will play a much more significant role in terms of feedstock. So.
Peter?
Yeah, I mean, in our big story, the more we can recover and recycle from what's already in the economy, the less pressure we put on the planet for digging up fresh resources from the ground. And the recovered and recycled materials generally already contain a lot of energy, so they're much less energy intensive to produce. So it obviously makes sense. But when we crunch the numbers, we can see that the pace of demand for these clean technologies is going to be so big that we're going to have, at least for the next 15 years or so, to really ramp up the supply side for the primary raw materials. and to do so in the cleanest possible way. We haven't yet really talked about the whole sustainability side of the story, but that's a very important part of the picture.
Right. Well, why don't we talk a bit about the sustainability side? And maybe, Rachel, I can come to you and talk about, this is obviously something that's becoming more and more of an issue, is, we've seen recent stories in recent weeks about, is the battery in your electric vehicle as clean as you think it is? Is it responsibly sourced? Has there been child labour involved in the supply chain? I know that's something you've done a lot of work on, and maybe you can tell us a bit about what you've been doing and how the industry is addressing some of those concerns. Rachel?
Okay, thanks, Mike. So actually, we have provided kind of the services for the RCI members to improve their performances on the responsible supply chain management and ESG issues in the producing countries. So actually, we have developed the ESG standard using for the mine sites. The mining companies in the producing countries, which is the guidelines for social responsibility in mining investments. So we also developed a accounting assessment tool to help the companies to carry out their self-assessment and to identify their gaps with their best practices, and then to develop their targeted policies and systems to improve their performances during their ESG assessment process. So far, we have prepared the assessment tools and the process, and we'll start the pilot testing of their assessment this year. And also some of the cobalt and the nickel mining companies and their main and downstream companies have discussed a lot about how to collaborate to implement the assessment in the on the ground. Also, we hope to call for the joint actions with the international companies to work together on the ESG issues. Besides, we also pay a lot of attention to the local sourcing issues and the community development projects. So we have promoted the member companies to work with their local stakeholders to carry out their community development projects in DRC and in Indonesia. So we know that more and more attention on the cobalt and nickel in the DRC and also in the Indonesia. So we have a lot of the discussion within the RCI and other international partners. So in the future, we would like to explore more cooperation opportunity to work on the sustainability and the responsible sourcing work on the critical mineral supply chain. Also, we have a prior discussion and communication with Peter in Europe. So also we could further discuss about the feasible way and how to implement the regulation and standards which has proposed by the EU and the US and the other countries. So we will encourage the members and other relevant companies to use our LSM ESG management standard to implement the special issues on the ground.
Thank you. And Zhou, the conversation about a price premium, I know on the previous panel that was raised. People like Peter, and I think KaLeigh as well, increasingly looking for cobalt that can be demonstrated to have achieved certain responsible sourcing standards or sustainability standards, etc. What's the incentive for companies to do that, and will a price premium emerge?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. Just to set some context, I think there's two drivers for a premium for sustainable product. Firstly, it's the additional costs of producing a product to that particular standard, particularly for new mines coming in, as opposed to the evolution of existing mines, which obviously there's a work-through period. So there's an additional cost to produce, but there's also an additional demand by the consumer to have an ethically sourced and sustainable product. So there's a premium that can be paid on top of that. What we're seeing politically is two different approaches between the EU and the US, more of a carrot and stick dichotomy. But the US approach is very much to incentivise. And the pricing index argument comes out of the fact that if the US is incentivising demand, let's talk about the clean vehicle credit as part of the IRA, and that's $7,500.
Inflation Reduction Act.
Yeah, so the Inflation Reduction Act. So as it stands, if you buy a compliant vehicle in the US, there's $7,500 US, which comes straight back to you as a tax check. Half of that is relative to the critical minerals sourced, both for the extraction and processing. But what's really interesting about that number is that if you look at a 60 kilowatt hour battery and a high nickel cathode, it pays for the battery, for the critical minerals. Now, not a lot of analysis I've seen in the marketplace on that, but effectively the US administration will pay 100% of the critical minerals, the lithium, the nickel, the cobalt, the manganese, assuming long-term pricing, for an average 60 kilowatt hour battery if it's extracted and processed under their guidelines. Now, that's a premium, a huge premium. And then the problem is how much of that premium, that value, which will be transmitted upstream. And the US has adopted a view that they need to have a simple administration of these credits, and they're using their IRS to write tax checks. And it's a geared up process, so they can do that simply. But from an offshore sustainable producer, how much of that will feed upstream by the time it goes through the OEM, the battery maker, the active cathode maker, precursor, et cetera, and that's the stimulus that we want to see at our end to participate in what I think is inevitably a dual price market, one for the Western world consumer with its high tolerance and the broader market.
And obviously, Australia is a free trade agreement partner of the United States. They qualify, as things stand, under the legislation. The EU doesn't at the moment. We can talk about that another time. Question. The US has obviously designed that piece of legislation to try and encourage investment in its free trade partners. Does the capacity exist at the moment?
No, and it's a long way short. We've done a number of pieces of analysis which show where the US and we'll call allied country demand sits today and where it will be, and the hockey stick that's coming up in the last part of this decade, and we're already underwater and will be more so going forward. I think if I can spend a moment, we're very encouraged by the IRA, we're very encouraged by what the EU's doing, but from the upstream sector, it has to be a stimulus that's there for long enough to bring in these new mines. So I talked about value share. The other key issue where it may fall over in terms of creating new production chains is longevity. It takes an OEM 2 to 3 years to do a prototype and then an initial production for a vehicle to take advantage of these credits. It takes 5 years or so from concept to build to commissioning of a battery facility and then getting to spec. It takes a mine 15 years. 15 years. And so what we need to do is build on the downstream stimulus that exists, as admirable as that is, and then co-invest as an Australian government, as a Canadian government, with the upstream to make sure that all those dollars, those incentives are aligned, and we can create a new industry response. Otherwise, you'll have a downstream that effectively will be beholden to a sporadic and underwhelming upstream.
So I'm going to bring KaLeigh in here because I feel like we've got two interesting people. We've got someone who is mining the stuff and then someone who needs to buy the stuff so they can refine it. What do you see? Is there capacity there? And Zhou was saying it takes 15 years to bring on a mine. It's going to take less time for you to bring on the refinery.
Yeah.
Are you going to have the mine capacity?
So we're not shying away on the cobalt hydroxide side from Congo. We have an ethical partner in Congo. And now it's important in Congo that our cobalt hydroxide is RMI certified and that it's ESG compliant. So, I mean, the Congolese capacity certainly exists. And there are a number of other mining opportunities that are up and coming. If it's okay, I do want to speak to the point, though, at least on the U.S. side, in terms of U.S. investment consideration, prioritization, of the actual raw material development, both mining and refining. I think it should have happened many years ago. I was advocating for this to happen many years ago, but we saw a true catalyst, an ignition of support and recognition towards the upstream development of this battery supply chain, firstly under President Trump. So Executive Order 13, I think it's 953, where he allocated under, I think it's ATVM program, $55 billion in investment to go towards the supply chain. You have DOE Loans Programs Office, this is funded with $412 billion. You have DOD that has just removed funding caps on mining and processing critical metal projects in the United States. You have XMCTEP that's allocated $27 billion towards this arena. And then you also have other funding programs that are not even totally publicly exposed, like OTAs. And you also have, not only do you have the IRA, which has incentives beyond just the tax credit. You get a 10% tax credit on critical mineral operation costs, 30% tax credit to people who invest in companies like mine in the US. Then you also have another bill, that I think it's the Infrastructure and Jobs Act, that put up $7 billion for the battery material supply chain. And then you have purchase programs coming out for the US government to put up money and potentially even prepay for some of these metals. A huge, again, buyer is our national defense stockpile. So in the Cold War era, we had about 13,000 tons of cobalt stockpiled. Now we're down to 333 tons, last I checked. And that's juxtaposed to China, that has about 7,700 tons that we know of cobalt metal stockpiled. So yes, I think it should happen sooner, and there's certainly more that should be done. But progress is being had on upstream development, financing opportunities, and even in early stage, DoD DPA Title III is now funding even bankable feasibility studies for mining and critical metal processing projects. So I'm very thankful for the leadership that my country is taking in that space, and there is certainly more that can be done. I would say just one last addition to that, there has been executive orders in pursuit for permitting reform and access to public lands containing critical metals. I think that's probably one of the greater vulnerabilities that we have in getting this industry up and running domestically. And so, but depending on the state that you're playing in the US, you see even some states even progressing quicker than others in that space. So just a little bit of optimism on the horizon.
And Pete, obviously we've talked a little about the Inflation Reduction Act, which I know has been a big topic of conversation in the last year, nearly. The Net Zero Industry Act is something we haven't talked about in the context also of the Critical Raw Materials Act. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about how the EU is also proposing, similarly to the Inflation Reduction Act, incentives, but also maybe you can also talk a bit about the Critical Raw Materials Club and the Mineral Security Partnership, and how the two sides of the Atlantic are talking together.
Well, that's a lot of stuff in one question.
Yeah.
First of all, let me say that I think the US Inflation Reduction Act has been massively helpful in waking Europe up to the need to act. We all know that China's been incredibly successful over the past few decades building up its market share throughout the value chain for these metals and minerals. And no, let's be honest, it's not all pure free market, level playing field conditions that have applied. There have been a lot of subsidies which have allowed that market share to develop, and a lot of state involvement, right? Now, if we just let things continue business as usual, that trend is likely to continue, and I think that's what both the United States and the European Union and others, like Japan, South Korea, the United Kingdom, and others have realized. We have to have a much more strategic government-driven interest in what's actually happening and where things are going if we want to get a better balance in terms of security of supply around the world. So we have introduced the Critical Raw Materials Act the same day as our Net Zero Industry Act. Together, this is our response to the US Inflation Reduction Act. We do not have the capacity that the US has to use tax breaks as the vehicle, so it lacks that simplicity and immediate sort of business case readability. We're a legal system-driven approach. That's why we create laws, okay? But I think the idea behind the Critical Raw Materials Act and the Net Zero Industry Act is to create the framework which will not give you the results from one day to the next, but will create the conditions to turn the tank around and get to where we want to in the medium term. The difference is the Critical Raw Materials Act is about the security of supply and the sustainability proposition of what we need for the European economy. And the Net Zero Industry Act is about the speeding up of the deployment of clean energy technologies, whether it's wind, hydrogen, solar, electric vehicles, heat pumps, even small modular reactors come into the picture. But the idea is, at speed, to get these clean technologies out there through a combination of identifying the strategic projects that we want to support and de-risking those strategic projects through streamlined permitting and access to finance.
Thank you. And I guess we can maybe come back to the international partnerships point. Maybe a slightly provocative question, but are we heading towards a period of protectionism? KaLeigh?
Oh, yeah. Well, maybe I shouldn't be so candid. I just think we're forced to. I mean, and I think that especially the COVID era and the disruption to our supply chains really woke us up to what can go wrong. And, you know, with China sanctioning Raytheon and Northrop Grumman, you know, what if in the future when we see this growing standoff between the US and China on these critical raw materials, what if China instituted a full-on ban with the US not having a single cobalt refinery, little to no nickel refining capacity? That could be devastating to our national security interests, especially when 77% of the world's cobalt refining capacity is in China, and 80% of cobalt chemicals are produced in China. And you pair that with the exasperating demand, the US is going to have to domesticate its supply chain and actively work against that dependence on foreign entities of concern. And so that's why you see these incentives on the IRA, and then that's why you also see the demands. So by 2026, the Department of Defense will not allow any inputs or components of the batteries used by DoD for the electrification process of their fleet to contain any materials from China, Iran, Russia, or North Korea. So,
Zhou?
Yeah, look, it's a very hard term, protectionism. I'm not sure it will go to the dictionary definition, but I think there's a prioritisation occurring. Countries are entitled to act in their own interests. And it's clear that the ownership and processing of these critical minerals is not in the interests, as the status quo is not in the interest of both the EU and the US, particularly when they're looking forward to targets of decarbonisation and energy security. So I think regulators and lawmakers will come in where free market forces fail. And if the free market forces can't achieve those targets, we're seeing the responses today from these different regional governments. And so I don't see that as necessary protectionism. I see that as accelerating the development towards prioritising those outcomes to their own goals. And the goals are laudable, including decarbonisation. So I wouldn't go as far as to say it's protectionism. I would say it's a prioritisation of national interest in stimulating those chains and focusing those chains on national outcomes.
Thank you. And Rachel, maybe I can come to you. I mean, I know from lots of my conversations that people have said, well, you know, this isn't about not working with certain countries. It's not about, taking some of the geopolitics out of it. It's about saying, well, maybe there's some legitimate concerns about not being overly reliant on any one particular source, but, I know, the free market is certainly something that's been around for a while. How do you see that?
Okay. So actually, as we know that RCI is the industry alliance and platform, and we are consistently existing the neutral position to help their members and other partners to improve their performances on their supply chain management. So to be frankly, so we have found out a lot of the potential collaboration opportunities rather than the lot of the issues under protectionism. So during the progress of the Cobalt supply chain, we have copied the best experiences and practices in the Cobalt supply chain management, which has a wide collaboration with the different countries, stakeholders working on the DRC, and maybe in the future in Indonesia. So we have found that during the collaboration in the identifying and the mitigation of the potential risks across the Cobalt supply chain and other mineral supply chain. So we have benefited a lot from the joint actions, especially in the local livelihood development, and to provide the occupational education for the local society. Also, we will find more and more new companies who has a lot of the capacity on the refining, on the mining, and other processing stages of the renewable battery industry. So we have seen that we have a lot of the potential partners to work together on the joint actions on the ground. So it is very good news for us. So we also keep the open and the collaboration attitudes for all of the global society stakeholders to work together. So this year, I think it is very significant year because a lot of the EU and US and Canada, Australia, and other main countries have proposed their own system or the standard and regulations on the critical mineral governance. So also we have a lot of discussion and research on them, and we have a lot of the provided a lot of the trainings and the seminars within the RCI members and with other wide range of the Chinese mining companies as well as the international companies. So we see it a great opportunity to collaborate, and also we have a lot of the outposts and the best practices sharing opportunities to incorporate more insights from the experts and the associations and the governments from all over the world. So in this year, in September 21st to 22nd, so the TRIPS-CMC will hold their second international forum on their sustainable mineral supply chain. So we have provided the policy of the vacancy and the international communication and dialogue platform for all of the stakeholders. So welcome to attend. If you have further information about this event, please contact our CI colleagues to contact me. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. So yeah, there's a message there, I guess, Peter, about collaboration. And we were talking about the move towards protectionism. I mean, I'm sure you wouldn't agree with that term, but what's your perspective on this? Is what is it going to look like in 2030? Sorry. Will the European Union be doing more of this? Will it be collaborative? Will the Mineral Security Partnership, the Critical Materials Club, be a factor in that?
So what's driving a lot of our thinking at the moment is resilience of our economy. And it's not very safe, in a resilience sense, to put all your eggs in one basket, because you create the risk of a single point of failure. And that's what happens when you have an over-concentrated source of supply. So we're trying to create a distributed network around the world. And in that context, that it makes sense to us as part of our story that instead of materials from all around the world going to China, and then China being the single hub for the world's needs, that we try to develop this capacity in many parts of the world. So the refining and processing is shared and serves various market needs. And in fact, we have some projects exactly on that at the moment, not yet in Africa, but in Latin America, it's happening already, particularly in the copper space. Copper smelting, European clean technologies, European investment, offtakes. This is the way we'd like to see more things going, and also in Africa as well. So we are developing our bilateral relationships with countries, as I said in my earlier answer, but we're also looking at how we can cooperate with other countries. And we're discussing this in the G7, we're starting to discuss it in the G20, and we're also members of the Mineral Security Partnership initiated by the US State Department last year, which is looking at a set of projects around the world, including in Australia, where we can de-risk and collectively and share the benefits collectively, but with a race to the top in terms of the expectations we have on environmental, social, and governance norms. And we came out with a text, an agreed text at Mining Indaba on precisely that subject. So we're optimistic that there is space to cooperate with other countries, both bilaterally and through partnerships such as the Mineral Security Partnership. The one I would say design flaw in the Mineral Security Partnership is the countries that basically want to consume are the members, but the countries which have the resources are not. And that's where the European Commission President has proposed the idea of a global critical minerals or critical raw materials club, which would be a kind of network which brings the producer countries together with the consumer countries, because you need to have that conversation with both sides of the market to have a really good way of talking about, well, what can we do in terms of ramping up supply sustainably? What can we do that is going to improve the environmental, social, and governance standards and make them the norm, rather than forcing, in a fairly colonial way, Western standards on other countries?
Thank you. I came across a really interesting statistic a while ago from Benchmark, and they said that they anticipate something like 3 trillion needs to be spent on investment across the value chain, but to meet the ambitions of the Paris climate change targets. I guess the question, therefore, is if that's the pot of money that needs to be invested, where will the investments fall? And do we think where do we think those will fall, and what do we think will be the incentives that make people want to invest in a certain place? And KaLeigh, maybe I can come to you and say, you're obviously an investor in the US. What is it that you look for when you're looking at those sorts of investments, and what drives you?
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, the ability to margin has to be there, and so there's so many factors. If I could speak specifically to our project, I think in terms of investment, the first place, at least on the upstream, that the industry needs to go to is refining capacity, because that can essentially triage us in this urgent sense, and the capex required, the time to commission required, the risk, the permitting requirements are so much reduced compared to the development of a mining operation. Both are vital, but refining is a way that we can start with a more de-risked approach and start producing something domestically soon. You'll see that Elon Musk has been echoing this in the lithium space, insisting that our greatest vulnerability right now is not lack of ore access, or in lithium terms, brine, but our greatest vulnerability is zero refining capacity. And so for those de-risking points, I think that's why it's a good investment. I think your technology has to be right. So something that we're doing at Westwin, as opposed to many other operations, is we're using a form of vapor metallurgy as opposed to hydrometallurgy. The chemistry is very old, but we're using a nickel carbonyl process, producing a cobalt carbonyl residue, then putting it through electrowinning. But that puts us in a position to do this in a more ESG compliant way, a more environmentally neutral way, and on the nickel side, not producing a solid waste product and sodium sulfate, and then therefore a more cost-efficient way. And so the tech has to be right, the team has to be right, and so I am young, but I am blessed to be surrounded by a wealth of experience and wisdom and gray hair that I honor very, very much. And so really getting people who've done it before, you can have all of the IP in the world, but if you don't have the experience to exercise that IP, you are at great risk of failure. And so, so I would say, tech, aim for the most de-risk place that you can in that supply chain. And I mean, the political implications are significant. I mean, we chose Oklahoma as the home of our refinery because it's a great state in terms of permitting and speed and deregulation. So those are just a few of the things. I would add one final thing in terms of investment behind this space, and something that makes me privileged to be in this room is that this industry is more than just an industry. It's one of great significance and global impact. And though cobalt especially has been so criticized as a place of human rights harm, this industry and cobalt and its sources can be a catalyst for a lot of human rights advancement. The element itself is not the guilty party, and it's a tool to be wielded, and it can be wielded for great good. And so I think understanding the mission behind what I hope everyone in this room is doing is critical, because these projects are hard. Many of us are in a startup phase, and if you do not have that ethos and that determination that, yes, there's a lot of money to be made, but there's a lot of good to be done, then I don't know if we can stick it out. And my team is compelled by that, and that's why many have invested in Westwin, is because they know we're going to work around the clock and diligently, because so much is at stake and so much impact can be made. So the mission, the technology, the people, the experience, and obviously the regulatory environment, and the de-risking measures. Those are, I would say, 6 of the most critical things in terms of investing in this supply chain.
Right, and maybe Zhou, I don't think you've got any grey hairs. I can't see any from here, but I think you've got a lot of experience still. What do you look for when you're investing? What do you look for?
Yeah, look, let me answer that, but let me just come back to the original question you posed, which is, what does the investment need to look like from an industry point of view? I agree with what was just mentioned. The first and foremost, in the cobalt market, the bottleneck is refining. We need to stimulate refining in order to feed those production chains of tomorrow, the markets of tomorrow. But once you've debottlenecked refining, you'll actually uncover the true constraint, which is the extraction. Mm-hmm. And what you want to do is do both concurrently, mm-hmm. and ultimately where you want to land is in fully integrated, robust chains, from mine all the way through to consumer, and then the recycling component from there. So what I can say is, on behalf of, I guess, the Australian mining industry, long life resources exist. Once you get rid of those 2 bottlenecks, then there is the geological resource globally in cobalt, lithium as well, nickel as well, to create long life resource extraction, processing, etc. I also agree with the idea that new technologies are going to play cost advantages and circumvent inefficiencies today. I mean, I still marvel at the idea of making a crystal cobalt sulfate for what particular reason, but new technologies are now looking at, for example, direct MHP to a precursor production, and all of that advancement, we may as well take advantage of that advancement whilst we're debottlenecking the refining phase. Mm. So to answer the question you just posed, what do we look at for investment? We're traditional miners. We look at very long-dated outcomes, very long-dated cash flows, net present values, which keep us up at night. And what we need is certainty. We need certainty to aim for. Now, we can provide all the below-ground certainty in bringing a mine in. That's a technical area. I've got the geologists, the miners, the metallurgists, not a problem. But we need a target to aim at. And when your metal price you're aiming at has the volatility of as we've seen in the last 12 to 24 months, it's difficult.
Yeah. I'm conscious, so we're about 10 minutes from the end, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to maybe try and end on a slightly uplifting question, slightly inspired by KaLeigh's comments earlier, and maybe, Rachel, I'll start with you. KaLeigh was saying that actually Cobalt and our industry has a real capacity to contribute to human development, to contribute to a better society, a greener society, a cleaner society, but also one in which we're creating good, high-quality jobs. What's your view on that? Is that something you spend a lot of time thinking about?
Yes, absolutely. So we have seen a lot of the potentials to co-work under the collaboration under how to implement, improve the performances of the human rights performances in the producing countries. Also, we have provided a lot of the trainings and tools for the our RCM members as well as the upstream companies. So we have established a regular communication mechanism with the up and mid and downstream actors, especially the local stakeholders. So we pay a lot of attention for the capacity of the operators in the producing countries. So we start from the Chinese company, mining companies operating overseas. So we provide them a regular capacity building seminar, dialogue, and the communication and dialogue opportunities with the local government and the civil societies. So also we developed a constructive assessment framework on the Cobalt ASM ESG management. So we view the Cobalt ASM as the livelihood value model. So we always explore the collaboration opportunity with the DRC government and the relevant stakeholders to work together, how to improve their local livelihood level. So using our different resources and technical support from their partners. And in regard to the growing performances of their global companies operating in the refinery and other battery manufacturers. So we hope to encourage them to join the work to carry out the on-the-ground actions. So in the future, so we view and we paid a lot of attention and to express our great positive attitudes for the producing countries stakeholders to work together on the responsible sourcing and formalized governance of their mine sites. So in individual company or individual country or individual stakeholder could not resolve and mitigate the potential ESG issues in individual countries. So it is a systematic circumstances and it involves a lot of the elements. So we hope to keep in the neutral position to embrace a lot of positive and constructive actions. So I just show one last perspectives and the findings from our research on the maturity of the cobalt supply chain companies. So we have collected the feedbacks from the upstream companies. So they think that they need more substantive support from the main and downstream actors who work together in the producing countries. So it is a joint actions and it is a lot of investment to be made. So we need the joint actions. So I think the one word and we could share the benefits. Also, we need to share responsibilities. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Great way to conclude. Peter, is Cobalt going to save the world?
Well, as KaLeigh has said, the mineral is neither good nor bad, right? It all depends on how you go about it. And I think what is going to be crucial over the next few years is really to shine a light on the supply chain. We need much more transparency in the supply chain, much more due diligence in the supply chain of these battery raw materials, Cobalt and the others. And one of the proposals that we've put into our Critical Raw Materials Act should also help. We really need to understand the true cost of these materials. We need to have an environmental and climate footprint for these materials, wherever they're sourced, wherever they're processed, because that's the only way that you can really put your hand on your heart and say to the end consumer, yes, this has been done in the cleanest possible way.
Zhou? Are you saving the world?
I think there's a wonderful alignment between our self-interest as companies, our national interest and the global interest in this case. So I come back to the point, we need to, this two-part process ahead of us of bringing in the midstream, bringing in the upstream. I can't see how any of those actions are negative. My only concerns are the effectiveness of those outcomes. My only concerns are creating sustainable outcomes. But I think with the level of interaction we're seeing now between the US and EU with respect to those government overlays, they're a really good first set of stimulus.
Great. And KaLeigh, just to conclude, you've talked a bit about your high ESG standards contributing to development. Is that part of your ambition?
Absolutely. So, and when addressing ESG, I think it's important to know that humans are the ultimate consideration to that. And so why it's important that we do make every effort to do things as environmentally neutral as possible and sustainably, making sure that we remember the reason we're doing those things is for the human impact among all of that. So and it is our mission at Westwin that all of our ESG considerations work for the humanity to be supported by those considerations. You know, there's a lot of negative public relations campaigns in the United States against Congolese cobalt. And many have advocated that solutions to that is complete absence and abandon of our longtime friend in the DRC. And to me, that is an absolute hypocrisy, because if you truly support ESG, you are abandoning the human consideration behind it. And so I consider our partners and brothers and sisters in Congo as truly that. And I believe a way to pursue a more sustainable supply chain is to actually participate in that supply chain and not to abandon it. And I believe that participation not only helps our environment, but again, at the end of the day, has human impact. So.
Well, I think that's a really great place to finish on. So thank you very much to the panel. Thank you, KaLeigh. Thank you, Zhou. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Peter. I think that was really interesting. Just before I conclude, I started the panel with a question to say, do people think the industry will look different in 2023 to what it looks like today? I'm going to end with a question to say, do people think that geopolitics will affect the market? So can I ask, if you think that the geopolitical situation will affect the market, could you lift up your hands? And could I ask you to keep your hand up if you think there'll be a positive impact? Okay, so I think that's a really positive way to end. So it seems like we've all got a positive outlook. It looks like there will be opportunities in the future. So with that, I'd like to just conclude and say thank you to the panel. Thank you to everyone for listening. Really appreciate your time. And I understand there's some lunch now, so overdue. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Fascinating, fascinating panel with so much to take from that. You know, we started about talking about the different clubs and the different political allegiances, and then actually ended up with a point from you, Peter, saying everyone has to be in the same room together, whether it's the suppliers, the consumers, just to bring everyone together, which I think echoes all the points here, which I think is a really good place to take us into lunch, to actually start those conversations about how to ensure transparency alongside sustainability and a just transition as well, with everybody on board. Exactly what you were saying, KaLeigh. Thank you.